round two of this discussion of my response to what I perceived the inadequacy of the liberal Asian studies response to the Japanese miracle. Now, to recap briefly, I think two credos involved here in driving my motivation. One is captured in the remark, slightly different in English than it is in the French original, from Pierre Loti's novel, Asiade, in which he declares, in a very different context, in the East, anything is possible. Now, this belief, and this is the credo not just of me, or for that matter, of Asian studies, a minority in Asian studies perhaps now, but it is the credo of what I call the Southern Celt school of Orientalism, basically Wales and Brittany. People, for example, like Ernst Renan among the Bretons, Chateaubriand as well, and then there's the whole Welsh gamut, which I will talk about. But the point is, and I guess this is first a belief in the East, and secondly, a particular kind of need. And here I fall into the orbit of French reflection, both its strengths and weaknesses. And here is the need for a proper philosophy, a proper grounded metaphysical epistemological foundation for what we're doing. In other words, make it a mixture of the most powerful mixture possible of science and philosophy to give us rigor. And that rigor applies to our framing of problems. And one of my grievances against what I call liberal Asian studies is the poverty of their framing. What they allow us to do is not good enough, and what they prevent us from doing is far, far too important. So there we go. Now, after I wrote Japan Beyond the End of History, there were some favorable reviews, there was a favorable comment, it helped me get a job, it was, okay, lovely. But there was a fundamental resistance. And the fundamental resistance, if you summarize in a phrase as I have, is that liberal left-wing academics provide the overwhelming majority of scholars of Japan studies in the West, in the English-speaking West, did not approve of Japan, did not approve of the Japanese. They were, not to put too fine a point on it, judged to be morally defective. Now, against that, being Welsh-minded in these things and very sympathetic to thinkers like Frantz Fanon, the West Indian philosopher and theoretician of the Algerian Revolution, is the need for a grounded body of theory to make anything at all. And this echoes another important French writer, Louis Althusser, the Marxist communist theorist, who said, the problem with French communism was that theoretically, philosophically, it was weak. And all kinds of things follow from this perception. So, confronted with this, having written the book and having had this uneven response, I decided to return to the issue in uniting it in two things. First of all, what did the Japanese miracle, how was the Japanese miracle to be considered, understood, placed within the canon of European thought? That was one. And secondly, having asked where this Japanese experience falls into our experience of successful polities, classical Athens, imperial Rome, Elizabethan England, the list goes on and on. United States, for that matter. Where did it fit into that? Polities, successful political systems. And against that then was the question that if you're going to have a grounding in theory, you're going to have master statements of the significance of these political phenomena. So where were the masters who explained, described, elaborated, and most importantly, framed the Japanese experience? And this was missing. I looked very hard at people like Maruyama Masao, the Japanese political thinker, and there was stuff to work with there, but he did not approve of post-war Japan in that sense. He certainly didn't approve of the pre-war roots of post-war Japan. So we had a constant problem here of where are the masters? Now, having done that, and having gone through the experience of Japan Beyond the End of History and the resistance to it, I thought, well, maybe we need to look at more fundamental problems. And that is the relationship of Japanese studies to the social science canon in the West. And having raised the issue of where miraculous Japanese experience fitted into the European political canon, on the one hand, and secondly, asked the question about where are the masters, we then proceeded to say, well, what does social science have to look like if it's going to sustain this enterprise to place Japan in our political framework, our philosophic framework, and at the same time say, either stimulate or actually do the hard, heavy lifting of being masters to explain the Japanese experience, because I think it was that important. Remember, the battle phrase of the South, Celtic, Oriental school. In the East, anything is possible. So that led me to do this book, which I put the cover on, Japan and the Enemies of Political Science. Now here again the problem was the word open. Open in political science meant open to the Japanese experience. And my colleagues by and large think open is being liberal, and the Japanese weren't liberal, and therefore the Japanese were the enemies of open political science. Oh, here we go again. So you see, whatever you do, there's a prejudice, a kind of mental closeness that prevents us from dealing with Japanese reality. And this drives me quite frankly to despair. So, having done that, let's go back and look at the foundational problems and what foundational problems we had. We had a problem of science, we had a problem of words, and we had a problem of thought. For example, words. Conventional Anglo-American philosophy's approach to language is from the standpoint of the area student. The student of any area study outside Europe, or for that matter inside Europe, is the poverty of their understanding of language. They have a simplistic, factual-based approach that levels and discards and excludes all cultural difference. Now, from a student of language, this is a complete disaster. So these were the things. Another one, of course, was free market economics. If you take a dogmatic approach to free market economics as the only rational approach to things, then all kinds of nonsense follows. For example, when the Maikao report came in, which is a major statement of what the Japanese were to do about structural economic change, leading university publishers here turned it down because, well, it's not economics. Oh my goodness. They asked economic advisors who were free marketeers, rigid dogmatists, and said, we don't want the Maikao report published in English. Now this is, again, this dogmatic cult counter. This is the economic equivalent of cancel culture. It doesn't apply just to humanities. It doesn't apply to left-wing politics or identity politics or any of those sorts of things. Here we had cancel culture operating among economists. That's why we had to go back to the social science base. We couldn't leave it. You actually had to say, is social science going to work or not? And if not, what can we do to make it work? Big question, big challenge, but a full measure of the importance of the Japanese achievement that force us to think about things like this. So that's what led to Japan and the Enemies of Political Science, as a survey of the strengths and weaknesses of the Western European social scientific tradition in approaching other cultures, non-Western societies, political systems, economic systems, what have you. Big questions that needed big answers, but in the first breath needed actually to be raised as a matter of serious intellectual intent. Now, not to be too harsh about this, this approach is not what you might fall under the rubric of scholarship light. There is heavy lifting involved in here. And a lot of my colleagues were completely unwilling to do it because they didn't think it was necessary. The heavy lifting for them, if they were on the left wing, was it had done by Immanuel Kant given the assumption that moral conduct is our truest access point into reality, that science itself could not compare. Ethics was the powerhouse here. To have a correct ethical position basically prejudged, trumped everything else. And you could just proceed comfortably without having to do any, barbell curls of any kind to build up your response because you had the answer. And the answer consisted of negative judgments of Asians, in essence. So, there's where we left it. And having got that far, then the real trouble would begin when we began to looking at Japanese ideas themselves, not just the output of Japanese economic statistics or measurable results of a functioning democratic parliamentary system. No, we began to look at really much bigger issues of what we might call the clash of cultures, clash of civilizations. And when that rubric is brought into play, the whole ballgame explodes. To be continued. I hate Android phones.